Hello, welcome everyone. We're having a great discussion this afternoon with Dr. Dilip Jeste on his book here, which is Wiser, The Scientific Roots of Wisdom, Compassion, and What Makes Us Good. Now, Dr. Jeste is a neuropsychiatrist. I'm going to keep the introduction brief, but hopefully it'll still do you justice. He's a neuropsychiatrist who has spent the bulk of his career studying psychotic disorders, including things like schizophrenia, mostly in aging populations, but also successful aging, which I know from, I've spent the past week reading up, into this book, and really so much of it is from that successful, side of aging that we see. So he's a renowned scientist, prolific author, over a dozen books, was the president of the American Psychiatric Association. He's been on every list from best doctors in America to world's most cited authors. He's a legend in the field. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Jeste.
Thank you, Mike, for a kind introduction. It's really my pleasure and privilege to be on your show. I have great respect for what you have done and you continue to do with the Mighty.
Thank you very much. For those who don't know too much about the Mighty, we're a community of millions of people who help kind of share experiences with each other facing any kind of health issues to help each other out. And I think it's probably worth noting how I'm always fascinated by how people get connected, within our community. The way Dr. Jeste and I got connected is through another Dr. Jeste, who happens to be his daughter, who is my daughter's neurologist. My daughter has a rare disease called 215q syndrome, and Dr. Jeste's daughter, Shefali, is really our kind of rock star researcher behind that, and has become a close family friend, over the years. I'm actually going to get to see her tomorrow. So again, welcome, Dr. Jeste. So for those that are watching now in real time, you can leave questions for us that we will try to get to at the end. We're going to break this up into three parts. The first part, I really find it fascinating how Dr. Jeste has really defined wisdom and the research behind all that. So he's going to give a short, 5 to 10 minute presentation first that will set up the context for our discussion, and then we can answer, or he can answer questions from the audience as well. So Dr. Jeste, take it away.
Well, again, thank you so very much, Mike. My daughter Shefali has been telling me what a wonderful job you have been doing, Mike, and your biography is inspiring, and your work with the Mighty is truly amazing. So it's really a privilege to be on your podcast. So, as Mike said, I published this book, Wiser, The Scientific Roots of Wisdom, Compassion, and What Makes Us Good. So I want to take a few minutes to summarize the main points, and then we will have an informal chat with Mike and then questions from you all. Okay. So what is wisdom? Wisdom has been around in all religions and philosophies for centuries. But it is only recently that it is being studied as a scientific construct. So when we started research on wisdom about 15 years ago, the first question I had was, what is wisdom? How do you define it? So I looked at the literature and we came up with a consensus definition. Wisdom is a personality trait, okay? It's a personality trait like resilience, optimism, extroversion, introversion. It describes a characteristic pattern of behavior in a person. And what are the characteristics of wisdom? There are 6 of them. The first and most important is pro-social behavior. The things that we do for other people rather than selfishly for ourselves. So this includes empathy, which means understanding and sharing another person's emotions or thoughts, and compassion, which means helping other people. Then comes emotional regulation. Think about a teenager. His emotions fluctuate from minute to minute. And then think about the wiser, older adult who has pretty good control over the emotions. Next one is self-reflection. That's the ability to look inwards, try to understand our own behavior. If something goes wrong with me, the tendency would be to blame somebody else. Instead of that, I should think about if I did something wrong that I could change and do better next time. Then comes something that is unfortunately sadly lacking in today's world, that is accepting uncertainty and diversity of perspectives. Okay. So I may have strong values about something, but I can understand why somebody else may have a different value system. I don't have to agree with that person, but I should respect the fact that people can have different perspectives. And at the same time, I need to be decisive. I cannot be sitting on the fence all the time. When I had to make a decision, I had to make a decision. And lastly, spirituality. Spirituality is different from religiosity. Even an atheist can be spiritual. So what is spirituality? Spirituality means constant connectedness with something or someone that we don't see or hear, whether we call it spirit, we call it soul, consciousness, nature, or God. The next question that comes in after you define something is how do you measure it? So there are scales for measuring different personality traits. So my colleague Michael Thomas, who is an expert in skill development, and we developed a scale called San Diego Wisdom Scale or Jeste-Thomas Wisdom Index. It has 28 items, and you have to say to what extent you agree or disagree with those items as they apply to yourself. We have shown that it has good to excellent psychometric properties. It has already been translated into more than half a dozen languages. Examples of the items. It is important that I understand the reasons for my actions. So that indicates self-reflection, right? Another is I have trouble thinking clearly when I'm upset. So that means lack of emotional regulation. That when I'm upset, my emotions take over my thinking. Number of studies have shown that older people actually do better than younger ones on some things. Younger people are clearly better in terms of the speed of processing, how quickly they learn new things, and so on and so forth. But there are a few things in which older people do better. One is empathy and compassion. Another is emotional regulation. Then comes positivity, that is favoring positive emotions and memory, and forgetting or ignoring the negative ones. Self-reflection and decisions that require experience because aging comes with experience, right? And these are all components of wisdom. So there is clearly evidence that wisdom increases with aging. It doesn't increase in everybody. There are some old people who are not wise and young people who are very wise. So it's not a one-to-one relationship, but by and large, I think most of people in the audience above a certain age will agree that with age we have become wiser. One interesting thing, I'm a geriatric psychiatrist, and so one question I always have had is, why do we live so long? Because the human lifespan, which keeps on increasing, it was only 45 years in the US in 1900. Today it is more than 80. Very soon it will be 90. This longevity makes no sense for Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest. So what is Darwin's theory? Darwin said that animals live only so long as they can produce babies, because the goal is to replace the people who have died. For a species to survive, you have to replace the dead people with a baby. So if you can't do that, if you can't produce babies, you are not useful to the society and you die. And yet we live, say if somebody lives to age 90, we still have menopause in women and andropause in men when we lose our fertility around age 45, 50. That means we would have spent 4 decades of life without fertility. We are no longer good for the species. So my theory was that something must improve to compensate for that lack of fertility in aging. And that's where this grandmother hypothesis of wisdom comes in. What it says is this, that if the grandma helps her adult daughter raise children, this adult daughter lives longer, is happier, and is more fertile. She produces more children than her mom did. So the grandma is not producing children anymore. However, she's helping her daughter to live longer, be happier, and be more fertile. And this is research that has been shown in whales, dolphins, humans, some of the best research and published in some of the most major journals in the field. Grandparents actually have an important role in bringing up grandkids. There have been many studies of this kind, but this was one study in the UK. 1,500 secondary school students aged 11 to 16. They found that when grandparents were involved in raising kids, as these kids grew up, they had fewer emotional problems, more pro-social behavior, and fewer adjustment difficulty compared to the kids in whose upbringing grandparents were not involved. And this was especially true in teenagers from single parent or step parent families who are at the highest risk of developing behavior problems. Many other studies have shown that intergenerational activities are not only useful for the younger generation, they're very useful for the older generation too. So this is really a win-win situation. Both the generations win. So, as I said, the title of my book is Wiser. So how do we become wiser? So the first step in becoming wiser is honest self-reflection. So one thing I would suggest is use the scale that we developed, the San Diego Wisdom Scale. As I said, it will take, it's 28 items. It will take about 5-6 minutes. That will tell you which component of wisdom you are strong in and which you are weak in. So then we can focus on the ones in which we are weak. And then there are strategies for improving each component. And I just want to give a couple of examples. So how do we increase compassion? One is gratitude diary. Have gratitude diary or journals. Before you go to bed, write a couple of things that made you feel grateful. Another is a random acts of kindness. Decide at the beginning of the day that you are going to help strangers just for no reason. Then this is important, spend time with people who are different from you. Different in their looks, different in their race, ethnicity, education, income, but also different in their perspectives. This is really something we need today to reduce the polarization, and volunteer in facilities for people with disability. Again, I don't need to preach this audience. You are great example of how to help one another with the family members who have disabilities of different kinds. So you really are role models of how to practice compassion. Equally important is self-compassion though. If we are compassionate to others but not to ourselves, that doesn't help. So how do you increase your self-compassion? One is self-kindness. If a friend comes to you and says he has some problem, you will say, oh, don't worry. There is some giving soothing comfort. So do that to yourself. Another is if you make a mistake, you feel terrible. But realize that everybody makes mistakes. So that's okay. And mindfulness. You are feeling stressed out, yes. But in the past you have felt stressed out and you got over it. It will happen again. So last couple of slides and I will stop. What is happening to our society in the last couple of decades is really not very good. We talk about COVID pandemic, but we have had another pandemic going on for the last 2 to 3 decades. And the pandemic is pandemic of loneliness. Loneliness has increased tremendously. Of course, the COVID made it worse because of the need for physical distancing. Research has shown that loneliness is a silent killer, as dangerous to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, more dangerous than mild to moderate obesity. In the US, in the last few decades, loneliness has doubled. Suicides have increased by 33%, at CDC statistic, and opioid-related deaths have increased 6-fold in recent decades. So even before COVID, we have been having a pandemic. The good news is that wisdom, especially compassion, may be the vaccine or antidote for loneliness. We have published a number of studies showing that wisdom and loneliness go in opposite direction. So that is the message for not just individual but societal wisdom. So as I said, we are living in a society today which is highly stressed, highly polarized, lonely, angry, anxious, depressed. Suicides are increasing. People hate one another when the perspectives differ. When loneliness has increased, suicides. We need to change that. How do we change that? Wisdom. That we need to not just practice wisdom, we need to teach wisdom starting at kindergarten. We need to do that in all our businesses, in all the jobs, in various government agencies, and God forbid, even politicians. If they become wiser, we'll all be happier. And that is, I think, our current education system focuses truly on hard skills. It doesn't focus on soft skills like compassion, emotional regulation, self-reflection, acceptance of diverse perspective. We need these for making ourselves happy, compassionate to ourselves and to others. I think that is what is needed. And this is my last slide. So if we do that, then we'll transform today's lonely, distressed, polarized world into a happier, healthier, and wiser society. And again, I'm just so delighted to be speaking with the mighty because you all represent some of the best traits of wisdom. So thank you. Let me stop here. And Mike.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jeste. That's it's fascinating to me, just in terms of the way that you've defined wisdom as a personality trait with those components. And I'll segue because you ended on loneliness, and we see so much of that in our community. We really started this because we wanted to help people get connected. People who are complete strangers, and yet they have a common bond, right? And they can help each other through a lot of issues because they've lived through them themselves. And I think it was a year or two into starting the Mighty when we actually recognized what we were solving for, and that's isolation. And we would see this in so many comments. I think the comment that would come up again over and over and over again was something around, I don't feel alone anymore, when they were on our platform and being connected. So let's start there. I watched a talk that you gave that was called The Modern Epidemic of Loneliness. And you talked about using wisdom as a behavioral vaccine. So tell us a little bit about that, because I think that folks in our community, they need a vaccine for loneliness in many ways. They need help with this, especially coming off this pandemic when we have all been far more isolated than we had previously been.
I think this is really sort of evidence-based fact. It's not just sort of feel-good TV science. We have published several papers, including thousands of people from across the country as well as in other countries, especially Italy. And where we consistently find that people who score high on wisdom are not lonely, and with especially compassion, including self-compassion. We actually just completed a longitudinal study where we found that people who had high level of compassion and wisdom at baseline, 7 years later, they were far less likely to be lonely than people who were not. And finally, and this is even more interesting, biologically, we have found that loneliness and wisdom go in opposite direction in measures on EEG, electroencephalography, and even microbiome. The diversity of the microbiota we have varies considerably between people who are wise versus those who are lonely. So what I'm saying is that wisdom and loneliness, actually, they have some biological implications. But the good news is that we can do something. So we are developing a new intervention to increase compassion, including self-compassion, in order to reduce loneliness. And so far, our findings are very promising.
That's fantastic. And so as you think about, you talked a lot about the, self-compassion, which comes up again in our community very, very frequently. What are some of the things that can help people? And again, I think about this past year that has been so hard for so many people. And one thing it was a very small thing in my own family. I've got 4 kids that my wife did, and I'd argue she's far wiser than I am. She set an alarm on her phone at 8 o'clock every night. And the alarm, the sound is the music, a Beatles song called "Here Comes the Sun." And it was a reminder that we would, as a family, talk about one thing that we were grateful for, because it was we're living in much more stressful time, but it was a moment, no matter what was going on, we were able to pause. And sometimes it was very funny, and we would joke around, and sometimes it was more serious. But it was just one small moment in the day that really did, I think, have an impact on our family. What are the types of things that you have found through your research that are, helping people that are struggling in so many ways?
And Mike, the example you gave was a fabulous example. I mean, that's like the gratitude diary, where you write something that you're grateful for. And here, what you're describing is you sort of make yourself realize what are the things that happened that made you feel grateful. And that's really important to have that. So making a habit of feeling compassionate as well as self-compassionate. And for mighty audience, I think compassion is not a problem. I mean, you are so compassionate. Self-compassion is a problem often, because people are seen commonly, even among, say, priests or physicians and other business people, who are very hardworking. They're very interested in sort of helping others, but they're harsh on themselves. They don't forgive themselves if they make a mistake. Mm-hmm. That's not good. Because, I give the example of, when we are flying and the security video comes on, and it says that if the air pressure falls, the mask will come down. Put on your own mask first before helping others. Mm-hmm. That's actually what we need to keep in mind, that we have to take care of our own health. Caring for caregivers is important, because then we'll be in a stronger position to help others. And so this can be done by reflecting on the things that made us feel stressed out. And typically they include something where you blame yourself. Mm-hmm. So what you do is then, again, accept the fact that everybody makes mistakes. And again, you have gone through hard things, and you will go through this also. But it's really important to take care of yourself the way you take care of other people.
Excellent. So when we talk about cultivating, you've obviously, spent much of your career now researching this, and but when it comes down to I was going to follow that with, you cultivated it in your own family, which is clear from your daughter, who I know well, who is among the people I'd say have so much raw intelligence, but also so much compassion, and that combination really comes through. What are ways from a let's say a parenting perspective that again, we think of wisdom as maybe being with an older generation, but if we're trying to raise kids with a sense of wisdom, what are the techniques, what are the types of activities that will really nurture and foster this in younger people?
Sure. I think what is needed is focusing on those. I mean, one of the problems I see in the current society is we focus so much on what is needed for future success. So we, obviously in the school, the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, mm-hmm. and obviously they are important. In medical school, how to be the best diagnostician. In engineering, how to be the best coder, so on and so forth. They are of course important. But it's also important, or in sports, how to be the champion, win all the matches. We should also reward sportsmanship in sport. And there are rarely awards for sportsmanship. Similarly, in schools, there should be awards for the most compassionate child, the most child with the greatest emotional regulation, and so on. So these are the things that we can consciously cultivate. And in a way, good parents do that. When the kid is growing up, 2-year-old, every time he doesn't get something, he throws a temper tantrum. And we say, no, don't do that. You won't get everything every time, but you have to control your emotions. You also teach the kid to share the toys with other kids. So that's compassion. when the kid doesn't do well at school, say, don't blame yourself. It's okay. I mean, you can. So, in a way, unconsciously, good parents do those things. But I think what is needed is consciously practicing and rewarding those behaviors, not just for the parents. I think it needs to happen at school, businesses, and elsewhere too. That we need to, societally, we need to focus on these things. I personally think that also there should be classes and courses on this.
Mhm.
So, education system has changed. When I went to school in India, all that we did was study, 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 and the usual, topic. Then there's the introduction of physical education, and then arts, which is great, and then sex education, and then diversity education, which are all great things. What about classes on emotional regulation, classes on compassion and self-compassion, self-reflection, accepting diversity of perspectives? These are important things because those are the things that will make us not only happier, but also healthier, live longer. So right now, what I worry about is depression, anxiety, and stress are rising, especially in younger people.
Mhm.
The rates of suicide have gone up, especially in the younger people. And it makes you feel so sad when you hear about a 10-year-old kid committing suicide. I mean, how can that happen? I mean, that's right. So I think it is because of the society being so pressured, and I thought that that's something we need to do. And again, when there are kids with children with disabilities, I think it becomes even harder because there is stigma about that, and they're being teased and bullied, etc. And yet, so I think that is where it will help to have self-compassion and have the whole support system. And again, what you are doing, Mike, is terrific, which is establishing a community. Now, actually, at adult level, there is something called compassionate community movement that started in UK a few years ago. Now it has spread in New Zealand, Australia, some parts of Europe, and it is making its presence in US. But that's exactly what is needed at all levels.
Very good advice. I wish school worked a little bit more like that, and I think we needed it especially during Zoom school over this last year when kids were trying to get through this over screens versus being in person with their classmates and their teachers. So what other advice would you give folks who again are for our community? Many people are going through health issues or caring for people that are going through health issues, and I'd say an increasingly isolated way. What are some of the day-to-day things that you would suggest? Maybe practical advice on how to feel a little less alone, how to connect with others in some way, how to bring some of these the things around self-compassion more into their lives.
That's an excellent question. So one thing to keep in mind is the number of social relationships don't matter. What matters is the quality of the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Loneliness is subjective. So, for example, you may have 5 friends and I may have 20 friends. So, technically, I am less isolated than you are.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I may feel more lonely because although I have 20 friends, none of those relationships is deep enough. Whereas you have 5 or even only 2 friends, but you have close relationship, intimate relationship, then you won't feel lonely.
Mm-hmm.
So what is needed is finding some people with whom you have a mutually trusting, respecting relationship. And some of those people, of course, you can have them in physical world, but you can have them on social media. And you don't need, again, thousands of people, not hundreds or even dozens of people. 2-3 people you connect with well is what is needed. And you can, sometimes it's a question of trial and error. You try to find out, make some new friends, some won't work out, but others will. But bringing community together is really helpful. And one other thing is self-reflection, that give yourself time, make time, something like 3 times a week. say that I'm going to spend half an hour just by myself, where I'm going to think about the things that stressed me out in the last 48 hours, also the things that made me happy in the last 48 hours. If you do that regularly, you'll find a common pattern to emerge. You'll find that we get stressed out by specific things. And so what are those things? For example, I may feel stressed out if I had to talk to strangers, or if somebody criticizes me publicly, or if I'm worried about how I would be perceived in a party, right? And then I think backwards. So why is it making me stressed out? And what can I do to improve? So again, honest self-reflection helps. And it's a question of making a habit. And then that will help us actually develop better relationship with others. So if some relationships don't work out, which will happen, why didn't they work out? What was wrong? And what can we do better next time?
When you think about, again, the cumulative research that you've done over time, and one of the things that struck me is I thought a lot about resilience over the last year, but wisdom is a little different, right? And so when I'm really interested in again kind of moving this from how I was thinking about it, reading your book. It's a level of compassion that comes into it that is a little different from what I had kind of read before. And again, your definition is more of a personality trait with those 6 components. What's the next step in terms of the research in this field and where it goes? You mentioned in your book that it's harder to measure things like this because these are, again, more of the soft skills, right? So what's the next step in terms of where the research takes us around wisdom?
So in terms of research, so I'm a neuroscientist, and I also do studies of brain in relationship to wisdom and loneliness. And we have published on neurobiology of wisdom, neurobiology of loneliness, because these constructs are based in the brain. But they're also obviously affected by behavior and environment. And so where the research is going is actually exciting, I think, in future. So we have identified specific parts of the brain that are involved in wisdom. So without technical jargon, I can tell you that those parts mainly involve the prefrontal cortex, which is the newest part of the brain, something that makes us human. And the other is something called amygdala, which is the oldest part of the brain, which is the center of emotions. Okay? And people who have damage to those areas, they lose their wisdom. Diseases that cause problems. But for me, the interesting thing would be, in future, as the neuroscience improves, we may be able to stimulate those specific areas and increase those components of wisdom or reduce their loneliness. So in future, I do see strong possibility of biological interventions to help reduce loneliness. At the same time, I think ultimately it is psychological, psychosocial. So we need to change our behavior. There's no question about that. The pills will help to some extent, but ultimately it is we who will change that. And so that's the research we are now focusing on. What are the various ways in which we can reduce loneliness? And, the common advice that people give is, okay, just go to parties, make more friends, have more social media. I don't know if that's always the right advice, or even I would say even often the right advice. You must choose the right people. And again, what I love about Mighty is that you have created a network of people who are like-minded, who have similar health issues. So here you are likely to be welcomed by others. Whereas if you just join the regular Facebook or Twitter, and you don't know what, and there are many examples of actually negative impacts of these. I mean, some people have committed suicide because of the negative comments they got from Facebook and Twitter. So we need to avoid that. Yeah. And connecting with the right people is actually the main thing that we find useful.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've done, I'll give a shout out to our moderation team. We've got 24/7 human support that is really designed to keep this a safe and supportive community, because people are very they're opening up in a very vulnerable way in terms of sharing things about their health, right? Not just like, hey, this is my favorite sports team or whatever, but these are real vulnerable things that are going on. And so I think particularly when it comes to health, we have to, really make sure that we're doing this in a supportive, environment. So that's, we found that that's, critical in order to get people to kind of open up and again, share those experiences. And as you mentioned, with social media has been seen to trigger things like suicide and all of that. We've done some great research with folks at Harvard to show that actually getting a daily dose of the mighty is reducing suicide ideation. And I think it is that it's amazing to me the deep connections that folks can form with complete strangers. And it's around, again, because they have a shared experience with health. And that's honestly going back to, starting this community. It was really with my daughter, the thing that helped my wife and I most was connecting with other parents halfway around the world who, had maybe an older child. So they'd been through a whole lot that we hadn't, been through yet. And, but that's really what our, community is designed to, to do. And I think has helped a lot of people, particularly over the last year, which has been challenging.
I think that's really important. And especially during the last year, you're right. I mean, during the COVID, it really became very hard. And Shafari, so my daughter was telling me that she was especially worried about children with disabilities, that for them, this physical distancing was really detrimental to their mental health. And so fortunately, I hope that this is over with the vaccinations and we are back to normal life. But also, I think it may have strengthened some relationships.
Yeah.
And so there were obviously some positive things that came out of that. But one thing I want to stress again is that self-compassion also includes really taking good care of yourself. It's a healthy lifestyle for the parents and the other caregivers. One cannot overstress the importance that, and people often don't do that, because we feel so it becomes so important to take care of people who need care. And there are, sandwich generation where you take care of your parents, one of whom may have dementia, and the children, they may have some disabilities. It's very hard.
Yeah.
It's really very hard. And that's where don't ever forget self-compassion, self-care, and you're doing it to help them. Because if you are healthy, then you can help them.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, because it's a message that I think our community really needs to hear around that self-care and compassion, and making sure you give yourself, that in order to, not just help yourself, but help others who you may be, caring for. One question that just came in is around, you talked a little bit in your presentation about spirituality. And so the question is around what are your feelings about religion or spirituality in your views on wisdom? So maybe again, kind of talking a little bit about how spirituality is different from just religion.
So religiosity and spirituality, I mean, clearly they share something, and they share a belief in something that is beyond one's knowledge. And there is actually quite a bit of research that has been done. Not all of the research has been high quality research, but considerable research shows that both religiosity and spirituality help improve health, physical health, mental health, even longevity. Now, so spirituality is not, so the difference is, of course, religiosity refers to organized religion, and you have specific principles, scriptures, beliefs, and so on. An atheist can be spiritual. So the two don't need to go hand in hand. And also we know of sometimes religious extremists who may not be spiritual, because spirituality involves compassion, empathy, helping others. And so based on research, I would say that there is good evidence that this kind of a constant feeling connected with something or someone constantly is bound to make you feel less lonely. Because you are truly never lonely because you are always in connection with somebody, although you may not see or feel or hear that entity. I mean, there are, of course, downsides to everything. So extreme belief or belief only in your own value system is not good because that needs to go along with this acceptance of diverse perspectives, right?
Mhm.
So it's really balance that is essential. But I would say that there's considerable research that does show that both spirituality and religiosity help improve health.
That's great. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the notes you've given us, the pointers around this. Again, we talked about self-compassion, self-care. I'm struck with the deep connections, relationships, less about the number, but more about the depth of those, which I do think for many people, they struggle because, they didn't see family. They didn't see folks, over the last year. I know one of the things that was, very helpful to me, I joke, I said it was my weekly group therapy, and it was just getting on Zoom with a bunch of friends and playing online poker, which it didn't end up being really about the poker. It was a place for us to vent about what we're all, kind of going through. It was a place for us to laugh, those types of things. And it honestly was very helpful, for me. And I know it was, for others in our little group as well. Some of whom, by the way, I did not know. It was a friend of a friend or something. And now it feels like I've actually, increased my friendships, in the depth of those around that. So, let's see what else here. One other question that came up was around the nature versus nurture, question. How much of wisdom are we, let's say, is just innate, and how much can actually be nurtured, just through the behaviors that we have, the mentors that we have, parents, all of those types of things.
Thank you for asking that question. That's really an important question. So most traits are partly genetically inherited.
Mm-hmm.
So there are genes associated with these traits, right? But on an average, it varies from anywhere from 30% to 60%. And this is research that is emerging. And wisdom has been relatively recent entity in terms of science of genetics. So we don't know for sure. But my hunch is 50% of wisdom may be inherited, which means that 50% is affected by environment and behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So we have much more control over it than we think we do. Now, it's interesting also to compare wisdom and intelligence. Intelligence and wisdom are not same. IQ, for example, what it measures is it really measures hard skills.
Mm-hmm.
And IQ doesn't change much during a lifetime. It is very difficult to increase IQ. I mean, except for people who are brought up in a very bad environment, and suddenly the environment becomes rich, and then they can do better. But by and large, IQ doesn't change much. It only decreases later in life. Wisdom is different. Wisdom does increase with experience, and since experience comes with age, it can increase with age. And intelligence, I think that's also one of the societal problems I see. We focus so much on intelligence. But some of the most intelligent people are not the wisest people. Actually, if you think about that, some of the terrorists or mass murderers, they're very intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
They are far from wise. They have no compassion for others. So we must separate the two out and focus on wisdom. And the main point is that we can become wiser. Wisdom can be increased, but we need to have that motivation and sustain habit to do that.
Thank you for that. It's good to know that we can become wiser. That's encouraging. So another question came in around, it's the latest buzzword is trauma. How does wisdom help overcome trauma?
That's a great question again. Mike, you talked about resilience. And I should say that resilience and wisdom often are related, although the definitions are different. Still, and the trauma is a good example of that. In the sense, so when there is a trauma, either personal or community level trauma, there is some natural disaster, for example, tsunami or war or whatever, drought. The experience is same for a number of people, but the way we react to the experience varies. We all know about PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are people who become so traumatized mentally that the depression, anxiety, stress continues. Sometimes there are flashbacks, etc. But there are also people who develop post-traumatic growth. So same trauma, which produces PTSD in some people, will produce post-traumatic growth in others. And these are the people, in a way, who are more resilient, obviously, but they're also using the components of wisdom to enhance their growth. And I would say again that mighty, most of the people, when you have a child that is, you find out, born or later develop some disability, it's a major trauma to any parent. Gosh, I mean, that's really, and I have heard the stories from Mike as well as a number of people in the mighty. Very touching stories. But what I find inspiring is that after the initial trauma, after the initial reaction, you all came out of that and managed to cover that. And then what many of you are doing is to going out and helping others who are now experiencing trauma. I think that's the way to react. And that's the way for resilience, post-traumatic growth, and becoming wiser.
That's great. I'd never actually heard the term post-traumatic growth, but I love it. I'm going to use it, going forward. I think it's an excellent example of how the same situation can produce a dramatically different result based on how you may react to it.
Right. And there's actually, it produces biological changes. We have published studies in which people, so we looked at some children who had childhood abuse when they grew up. And we found that some children were doing very well. These are the children who had more resilience and the post-traumatic growth. And then other children didn't do as well. And we found there were differences in the two groups in terms of their hemoglobin A1C level, for example, which is associated with diabetes. Their markers of inflammation were different. So when we do these things, which result in post-traumatic growth and resilience and wisdom, they're helping our body also. So that's something worth keeping in mind, that it has biological effect.
Well, thank you. I know we've got to wrap this up, but I want to encourage folks who are listening in to read your book, Wiser, The Scientific Roots of Wisdom, Compassion, and What Makes Us Good. It's encouraging to hear that it is something that we can increase. I know raw intelligence is a little harder to do so, but I really appreciate the soft skills in other people and in what, our own family in terms of facing some of the challenges we have. The soft skills, I think, have really, just helped us not just cope, but as you were talking about, kind of growing, through that. And I hope that, again, folks in our community who are facing a number of challenges can use the research in your book, the practical advice in your book to help themselves and to help their families. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And thank you for just all the work that you've done in this space.
Thank you for having me on your show. As I said, I have really great respect for what you do with the Mighty. And that's really, for me, great example of resilience and wisdom. And similarly, the work you described about reducing the risk of suicide, that's amazing. I mean, that's the kind of work that is needed for stemming these pandemics of suicide. So, so you are really, your organization and you yourself are role models of wisdom.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Take care now.
Bye.